All right, Isaac, we're going to come and get your brain working really hard once again. Now, you know, as we go through, we're accumulating knowledge. Now, I don't expect you to remember all of this as we go. Because you've got the notes, you've got it written down, you can go back and look over it. But to get the general picture in your mind, we need to go through it all and get a good understanding of this whole textual issue and the reason that we have all these new versions and how the new versions were developed. And we're gradually doing that now. You can see where we've come, and it's a big study. It's not something you can just do in a couple of lessons. We have to look at the background and all the things that have happened, and we have to know our case. Now, we don't have to know it word perfect in our head. We've got it all written down, and I've researched it and put it together fairly comprehensively. And then there are books. There's a book called Final Authority that you could read, and it's a big help. And then there's Gail Riplinger's book, New Age Bible Versions. You could read that book too. They're not just novels, they're really textbooks, and you need to sit down and read and study them and get the information that they've got. There is so much information available about this whole issue, but most people never look into it, and most people are not interested, and most people just take notice of whatever the publishers say, and they've got no convictions about it, because most people really believe in dynamic inspiration and not in verbal plenary inspiration like we do. So we come back to lesson 5, and we are examining what we've got available to us in manuscripts to decide which is the authoritative text. And we discover immediately that there is a great deal of evidence available to us. Now, I want us to get this in perspective too. Most of literature that is preserved throughout history, there's a couple of copies or a few copies and some evidence. Gallic Wars was written by Julius Caesar, and there's 6 good copies of it that collate together. Then there are 3 copies where the people who have copied it have obviously done a very bad job. And so basically it's got 6 good copies and 3 corrupted copies, and yet scholars think that that's absolutely plenty, like far more than they need to justify saying, yes, we've got exactly what Julius Caesar wrote. Now, when we come to look at the manuscript evidence for the scriptures, there's over 5,300 manuscripts, and so the evidence is just absolutely huge, overwhelming. And we saw that the evidence of the New Testament is composed of papyrus fragments, and that's the first thing, and manuscripts. Now, get this in your head: unical, that's uppercase, and they're called modified capitals. And minuscules, that's lowercase manuscripts, and they're called cursives. And then there's lectionaries, like prayer books. Remember, we talked about them. Very common in the early church. And as of 1995, there were actually 5,366 manuscripts extant. What's extant? It means they exist and they are available. We know where they are. We know that they do exist, and they still exist at the moment. And these include 2,209 lectionaries. So lectionaries are a very important part of the evidence, and we need to understand this. Papyrus fragments, unical, uppercase, documents, manuscripts, minuscule, lowercase manuscripts, and lectionaries. So this is evidence that we've got. Right, now each of these pieces of evidence, every piece of evidence, manuscript evidence, has been named, and each name has an abbreviation for convenience. And we need to get an idea of how these are classified, because people will say to you, oh, P76 says this. Now, we'll have a look at that and we'll see if we can work out what P76 is. Right, many, as well as having a name, also have a number or some form of designation. Now these extant manuscripts, those that are available and still exist at the moment, are, as of 1995, as follows. Now the designations of them won't change, and so we can use these same designations, they won't change. First of all, we've got papyri. Now, as of 1995, there was 88 papyri manuscripts. Now, they're not really books or anything. Most of the papyri we set up the top here, many are just small scraps of original documents. Some of them are quite comprehensive, but many of them are not. And P76 means the 76th papyri manuscript that was discovered. And so we can look at the papyri and say, when anybody says, oh, this is P43 or P76 or whatever, we can know that that's a papyri document, and we can know what it contains. Copies of it, we can even get copies of it because it's all been photographed, and we can actually look at it ourselves and say that's P76. Not that we'll be able to read it, right, but we'll know what the textual experts are talking about when they talk about P76. Then we have the unicles. Now there's 274 of the unicles. Now what's a unicle? We said it's an uppercase document or manuscript, and these are very important because they are the ones that are more like complete books, codices, most of them, and there's 274 of them, so they contain a huge amount of textual evidence. And in fact, these are all given names, and they're given a letter of the alphabet or some designation like that. And so Sinaiticus, Textus Sinaiticus, is called Aleph, and Textus Vaticanus is called B, and Textus Beza is called D. And so when somebody says, oh, this comes out of Vaticanus B, well, we can know that that's a unical, it's a codice, it's a book. It's not a complete New Testament, but it's got a lot of it in it. Sinaiticus has got a lot of it in it, it's Aleph. We can talk about Alexandrinus, it is A, and it's got a lot of the New Testament in it, in fact almost a completed New Testament, but it's really a composite of other ones as well. And these are important, they're the basis for the new versions, as well as for the Textus Receptus, because we have the Textus Receptus is represented in the unicles very, very strongly. A vast majority of the unicals support Textus Receptus, but Westcott and Hort picked out 3 of these unicals, the Sinaiticus, Aleph, it's called Aleph, Vaticanus, it's called B, and Beza, it's called D, and combined them with Alexandrinus, A, and so it was really only 3 or 4, you might be able to say, out of 274 And that's what they based the whole new versions on. And that's what most of the new versions these days are based on, just those 4. But really they all come under the heading of Alexandrianus, and so really it's only 3. So out of all the evidence that we have, all that Westcott and Hort used was really 3, or you might be able to say 4, of the unicals. Now that, we call that into question immediately. Then we've got minuscules, and there's 2,795 of them, so they're very common. And minuscules are lowercase, right, documents or manuscripts, and they are very numerous, and they supply us with a great bulk of our evidence as well. So unicals and minuscules provide us with a great deal of evidence. Papyri doesn't give us much evidence, but it's very early evidence, so it's very important. And then we have 2,209 lectionaries, and they're numbered from 1 to 2,209. And so we can, somebody will say, oh, this comes from L or lectionary 1,118. All right, well, we know what they're talking about now. If somebody says this comes from minuscule, say 56, we know what they're talking about. And so this is the evidence that we have. And so we see that the manuscript evidence is abundant. There is tremendous amount of manuscript evidence. No other ancient writing has even a fraction of this amount of preserved evidence. In God's grace and mercy, He ensured that we have every opportunity to evaluate this vast body of manuscript evidence in our search for the correct and authoritative text of the New Testament. Now, over the centuries, as the manuscript evidence has been discovered, the textual scholars have looked at all this evidence and collated it for internal agreement. Right, now this is their job. This is what textual scholars do. We're not textual scholars. We're not pretending to be. They're the ones who look at it, and they decide what fits where and what fits with what. They look at it for internal evidence, and what they do is say, now here's a new manuscript. Where does it fit with all the other manuscript evidence that we have? And they collate it, and they put it in the different groups. So if they discover something and they go through it, we'll say they discover a manuscript that's a part of a unical. They'll go through it and they'll say, oh, now, where does this fit? Does it fit with any of the texts that we've already got? And they look up and they say, sure enough, this fits with, say, B, Vaticanus. And they say, we'll classify this as part of B, and so it'll fit in that particular spot. And that's their job, to look at it and say, what is it? Where did it come from? How old is it? Where does it fit? And to fit it in, to collate it. And they've done that for us. They've been doing it for a long time. As manuscript evidence becomes available, different people have been appointed in modern times to do this particular job, and we'll leave that to them. We're happy if they say this belongs with B or this belongs with the majority text or whatever. We'll be satisfied with what they decide about it, right? So in the next lesson, we're going to see what they have discovered, how they have collated it, and the way they've seen it. And you'll be surprised that the scholars who've done this job support us 100%. Right. Now, to add to this, we've got all this textual evidence, and we're going to evaluate that later on. But we've got all this, but to add to it, we've got 2 other sources of information that put the matter of the correct and authoritative text beyond dispute. Now, if we only had all this 5,366 manuscripts as evidence, we would have far more than we need. But there's more. And this is something that we need to understand, because it puts the icing on the cake for us. It makes it absolutely positive that we've understood it correctly and we've got it right. Now, these two sources are, first of all, early translations. Now, think about this. By the 2nd century AD, translations of the New Testament were being made into several different languages, right? So, the different nations wanted the Bible in their own language, particularly the New Testament, and so translations were made. Now, naturally, these translations being the result of verbal equivalence, because back then, particularly close to the originals, close to what, say, Matthew had written or Mark had written, anybody who translated it said, this is God's absolute inspired word. This is verbal plenary inspiration. I better be very, very careful about my translation. And so naturally these translations, being the result of verbal equivalence, perfectly reflect the Greek text from which they were translated. Now, we can now look back at these translations, and copies of them are extant, right? They're readily available to us. And we can look back at them and do it backwards, go from them back to the Greek text and obtain evidence about the Greek text from which they were translated. And so this gives us a huge advantage. We can look at them and say, these were done before the texts that Westcott and Hort say are the oldest. Right, now, do you understand this? Westcott and Hort said, we're going to use these texts. We're going to use Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Beza, which combined makes Alexandrinus, and we're going to use them because they're the oldest, they're the closest to the originals, therefore they're the most likely to be right. Now, we go back to early translations which were translated before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were even written. And we can check what was there before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus by looking at the early translations. And if we discover, now, for instance, if there's a portion of Scripture that we are led to believe by modern scholarship should not be in the Bible at all because they do not appear in the early unicals, that's Codex A, B, Aleph, etc., of the 4th century. Remember, Westcott and Hort said this is the first stuff that's closest to the originals, but it was from the 4th century. Now we can go back and look at stuff that's in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, long before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were written, and we can see what text was used then. So when they say to us, oh, here's a verse that shouldn't be in the Bible at all, and we've taken it out, right? But we can go back to ancient translations which predate these unicals. We can go back to something before them and see if this portion is included in them. If they did indeed include this portion, this would be strong evidence that the modern scholars are wrong. In fact, it would be proof that they're wrong, right? So 1 John 5:7 is a case in point. It's the strongest statement in the King James Version on the Trinity, but it's removed from the New Greek Critical Text for the supposed lack of manuscript evidence. Now, what happened was Westcott and Hort said, look, this verse shouldn't be in the Bible because it's not in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, Alexandrinus or Beza. Right, but do the ancient translations include it? Yes, they do. Indeed they do. In AD, there was a translation called the Old Syriac. It was done in AD 170, long before Vaticanus or Sinaiticus were even thought about, and it includes it. in AD 200, the old Latin translation. It was in it, right. In the 4th and 5th century, it was in the Latin Vulgate. In the 4th and 5th century, it was in the Italic. Now, these are versions of the Bible, not versions, translations. And we can look at them and we see that it was there. And this is very weighty evidence for this verse.